I've chosen a short passage from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5 this morning, in which Jesus gives two very interesting and very simple metaphors as reasons for why you volunteered to be on planet Earth right now. And the first one is to add flavor to life, and the second one is to add light to life. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, it be made salty again. It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. These are words inspired by God. So, as you know, I take a theme for each month, and I develop the theme during the first 2 Sundays of the month, and then on the third Sunday, I do a recap, and then open it up to Q&A. And so today I'm going to do a recap of the homilies I did on January the 7th and January the 14th, and then open things up. And the theme I'd chosen was from the book that I co-wrote in 2013 with McKay and Ralph Metzner. It's called Why, What Your Life is Telling You About Who You Are and Why You're Here. And over the course of the last 2 weeks, I took 15 separate little topics from that book and began to expand on them. And so today I'm going to do a quick recap of those points, and then we can talk to each other. So the first thing I wanted to hit on was the notion of consciousness. It's called the hard problem in science, trying to define consciousness or figure out where consciousness comes from. So about 2 or 3 years ago, I have the practice of seeding my dreams before I go to sleep at night. And I ask, the spirit world to give me a definition or an insight in something I'm wrestling with in consciousness. So I asked for a definition of consciousness. And I woke up about 2 o'clock in the morning with a very brief little definition. It said, consciousness is source saturated self-awareness. So it is the presence of God within. So consciousness is saturated completely with the self-awareness that only God exists, and we are holographic fractals of source. We are how God experiences. We are the beehive. God is the queen that sends out the bees to gather the pollens, the nectars, and the stories, and we are the bees who come back with the stories and the pollens to make honey in heaven. But the cosmos into which we parachuted is it's a playground with some very, very scary rides. And Earth, I believe, is one of the scariest rides. Of all the places you could volunteer to incarnate into, and of all the dimensions, this is one of the densest and the darkest. And so only the kind of the heroic figures volunteer for Earth mission. Except we come down and then most of us forget the reason we're here. So that's what I wanted to say about consciousness then. I spoke as well then, secondly, about 3 levels of the self. When I think of the self, I think 3 different levels of it. So the first part I call my role self. And the role self in Hinduism we call the jiva, that aspect of the soul that incarnates. Now, I think there's a role self not just for the individual, but for the group as well. Every culture, every nation, every group has a kind of a role self. There's a reason why it's a group, not just for the kind of the edification of the individuals within the group, but the group is making a contribution to the bigger picture as well. So that's the first level of the self, the role self. So this time around, I've chosen to play the role of an Irish priest. The second level, I call it the soul self, and Hinduism would call that Atma. And again, I believe there's both an individual and a group component to that. And so there's the individual soul, the individual holographic fractal of source, but there's a group soul as well. There's a cohesion within a group when they're acting purposefully together. And I would call that the soul self of the group, whether the group is a family system or a culture or a nation. And then the third one is, I call it the source self. This is the ultimate self. This is, the God of whom every single one of us is an articulation. And once again, there's an individual realization there, and there's a group realization. It's not just that the mystics realize that they're one with source. but that groups need to come to that realization as well, as Thich Nhat Hanh pointed out really, really beautifully in one of the readings today. So for me, then, there are these three levels of soul. So it becomes really important then how we self-identify. When you think of yourself, when you say I, what do you mean by that? And most of us, we conflate the I with the ego, or with our physical body, or with our thinking, or with our emotions, or with our relationships, or with the profession we're in. And we're none of those things. So Hinduism says very beautifully, I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have emotions, but I'm not my emotions. I have an intellect, but I'm not my intellect. And I would add to that, I have a personality, but I'm not even my personality. The personality is simply the interface between the soul and the environment in which it finds itself. And so I say, I'm a holographic fractal source. That's my ID. I'm a soul on safari on planet Earth. I'm a spirit in a spacesuit. I'm a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for human incarnation. So it becomes important then that we figure out, when you say I, what do you really mean? That was my second point. The third point I make was to talk about a personal cosmology. And over the years, I would say, if there were one topic that I've come back to most frequently, it would be this idea of creating a personal cosmology, a personal philosophy of life. And I believe it's built around four basic questions. The skeleton of a personal cosmology is the answer to four questions. Who is God? Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? And the personal cosmology must be able to deal with all these four questions. And if we get it right, it'll do four things for you. Firstly, if you get it right, it will make your soul sing. There'll be a recognition from your soul self that, yes, I've understood now what my purpose is. Secondly, it will stretch you out of your cosmologically comfort zone. So, most of us have found a little niche and we don't like to be disturbed. The personal cosmology should shift us out of that ground into a different understanding. Thirdly, it should be able to explain everything that you experience. If there are gaps in your personal cosmology that are not able to account for certain experiences you're having, then it's still inadequate. You still haven't developed it sufficiently. And then fourthly, it must be constantly updated. As you have new experiences, you have to tweak your model, just like science did in the 20th century, tweaking the models from relativity theory to quantum mechanics. Sometimes you have to even radically disrupt the previous system in order to create a brand new model that can accommodate all of the old data and all of the new anomalous data as well. So that's the function of a personal cosmology, I believe. Then I like to talk about this 2x2 matrix. Imagine a window pane with 4 panes of glass in it. And so basically, you've got 2 columns and you've got 2 rows. So it creates 4 panes of glass. So the 2 rows I call conscious and unconscious. And the 2 columns I call good and evil. And so now you've got 4 panes of glass. So those who are unconsciously good are simply lucky. Those who are unconsciously evil are asleep. Those who are consciously evil are pathological, and those who are consciously good are enlightened. So it becomes really, really important for us to bring everything to full consciousness, and then to make sure that we're moving from a kind of pathological, self-engrossed, narcissistic behavior into the compassion for everybody else. So that's briefly what I said about the 2x2 matrix. I wanted to differentiate then between, I think there's a distinction between karma, fate, and destiny. And so karma is not a punitive mechanism whereby I'm being punished in subsequent incarnations for mistakes I made in previous incarnations. There's nothing got to do with punishment. It's the lesson plan. It is actually the plan that you formulated with your spirit guide before you incarnated. So karma is the realization when you're born, if you had the consciousness to realize it, whatever circumstances you were born into, where and when and what family at what stage of human history, it's exactly as you planned it. So karma is a way to go. I got it right. I was born into the precise circumstances I needed to develop the virtues I want to develop in this group. And so it's realizing I'm part of a soul group, I call a soul pod, and maybe I'm going to encounter a shadow pod, people who are going to kind of test me and tease me in some senses. Now, I use the words fate and destiny then interchangeably. Often they're synonyms. So it's not important which word I use for which, but basically the difference between them is this. So I'm going to just break it down this way. Fate is where my life should lead me if I'm following the karmic plan. So my fate is what happens when I'm following and doing precisely what I volunteered to do before I came. Destiny is where I wind up if I don't follow the plan or the volunteering for which I came down. Now, you can actually switch fate and destiny. It doesn't matter which you switch, as long as you can differentiate between what happens when you follow the plan for which you volunteered and what happens when you don't follow the plan for which you volunteered. So then there's a big distinction between karma, fate, and destiny. The sixth point I made was to differentiate, to talk about wise mind. A wise mind, you have to distinguish between wisdom and knowledge. I've said this many, many, many times. Knowledge is data which is generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom are data which are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. So there's a big difference between wisdom and knowledge. Now, wise mind then is not the same thing as reason or the intellect, and it's not about emotions. It's a deep, deep, deep intuitive knowing. It's a knowing that's coming from the soul self. It's it's really coming from source itself. Now, so there's a big difference then between the problem-solving mind, which is about fixing things, and the wise mind, which is about how to live. So the problem-solving mind is not that interested in fixing things initially. I told you the story about the old man in Africa who told me very, very famously one time, a problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And so if all I do is solve the problem, life will give me another problem. Wise mind is about how to live. And that means initially transcending, elevating away above the immediate issue or the immediate problem in order to see connections, much more elegant connections, so that when you come back down, you problem solve much more elegantly. I went on to differentiate as well between joy, pleasure, happiness, and perfection. So joy is being present to an experience, but it passes really, really quickly. The beauty of the moment always passes. It gets hijacked by the past or by the future. So sitting, watching an extraordinary sunset over the Pacific Ocean can bring extraordinary joy to your soul. But the sun is going to go down, and it's going to get cold, and you have to go indoors. And so joy is a passing moment. While it lasts, it's beautiful, but it's not going to last. Pleasure is very different from joy. Pleasure is about the release of endorphins. It's a neurological process. It's not even an emotion. It's a neurological experience. And all mammals habituate to pleasure. No matter how much you love something, you're going to have to get more and more frequently in order to get the same kick out of stuff. So pleasure is basically just a neurological experience to which all mammals will habituate. Happiness is very different then. Happiness occurs when I'm temporarily aligned with the mission. And so there's a contentment with what is happening. And I'm harvesting it for love. And it's based on how we want to be, not on what we want to happen. It's not about trying to create a fixed outcome. It's about harvesting the moment right now, being totally aligned, albeit temporarily, with the purpose for which I came. Perfection is related to that in some senses. Perfection is the radical commitment to the mission. And it's based on the teleological premise. Telos in Greek means the end point, that to which we're striving. So perfection is not about a stainless steel sinlessness. It's being utterly committed to the purpose for which I incarnated. And even sin then is a part of that. Sin is basically a feedback mechanism taken from archery in the scriptures, which tells me where my efforts are landing, what effects my efforts are having, so that I can readjust my aim. So perfection is, no matter how many times I fall, I pick myself up and I'm still committed because I know exactly why I came. And then finally, enlightenment is the permanent alignment with mission, where happiness is the temporary alignment with the mission. Enlightenment is a permanent alignment with the mission. But enlightenment is a slider phenomenon. If I were to use a kind of electrical metaphor, when you go to the wall switch in your house, if you have a binary switch, it's either on or off. But a slider, you can increase the luminosity of the light. So enlightenment is like that. It's not you're either enlightened or you're not enlightened. Enlightenment is a process of constantly sliding it into greater and greater love. So that's the distinction I made between those. I spoke then about life being improv theater. There is no plot and there is no script. We don't come down here with a script and a plot. Otherwise, we wouldn't learn. We'd be pre-programmed robots. If there were a script and a plot, we'd just follow it blindly. So improv theater, told you one time I had a client of mine who was a professional actor, and he did a lot of improv theater. And he said there are 2 rules to improv theater. The first rule of improv theater is that you have to work with any line that your partner throws at you on stage. You can't say, that's a dumb thing to say. Give me another line. I can't work with that line. You have to work with whatever line life is offering to you. And secondly, your job is to make the other guy on stage look good. So to feed your partner lines that she'll be able to turn into something really, really productive. So they're the 2 great rules of improv theater. There's no script, there's no plot, but you have to work with what life gives you, and you have to try to make others look good if you're in a partnership. The greatest lesson then that planet Earth offers us is how to love in the face of pain, because we're all going to experience pain in various ways. And the question then is, how can I learn how to love in the face of the inevitability of pain in my life? That's the greatest lesson planet Earth has to teach us. So then, we are not here to be judged for our mistakes, but to learn from them. As I said, from the archery, the feedback mechanism allows us to learn. I did A and B happened. I don't like B, so let me stop doing A. I did C and D happens. I like D, let me keep doing C. I went on then to differentiate, 2 different kinds of gifts that we bring with us onto mission incarnation. And the 2 different kinds of gifts are our talents and our problems. Our talents do not belong to us. We are like a mailman with a bag of letters, delivering these letters to the world. So our talents, are meant to be distributed to the world, not hoarded as if they belong to us. They do not belong to us. We're being gifted by God to deliver the mail to the people whose names are on the envelopes, whatever that might look like. And our problems are our gift to ourselves, because our problems are the guarantee that we're going to have to stretch and grow in this lifetime. But the difficulty is many, many times we hoard our talents. We claim they belong to us, and we project our problems onto other people and say, it's not my problem, it's her problem. And so these are the 2 kind of gifts with which we come. And what I've discovered over the years as a psychologist is that when people ask, what do you think my unique mission is? Can you give me some clue as to what my unique mission? Now, we all have a general mission, which is to wake up other people and to wake up the world. But what might my unique mission be? And I learned over the years that there are 2 kind of clues that help you to discover what your individual unique mission is. And they are the talents you have and the fears you have. So when you look at your talents and your fears, it will indicate to you what your unique purpose is down here. And it's fascinating to me that even with 8 billion people on planet Earth right now, and given the fact that we're all here to wake up, to wake each other up and to wake the world up, how can you have these plethora of different missions? And it's very simple. It's from just a small few letters, from 26 letters in the English alphabet, we create almost 900,000 English words just by recombining these alphabetic letters. Music, we have 7 chords. All of music from Tchaikovsky, to the Beatles is composed of just these 7 chords. With the DNA, we just have 4 nucleotides. But these 4 nucleotides in different combinations create all the life forms on planet Earth. And the simplest example of all, Boolean algebra, computer science, binary mathematics, is based on zeros and ones. And everything you see in your computer, all the images and all the sounds you hear, are combinations, permutations of just these 2 symbols, 0, 1, on or off. So the fact that you have talents and you have fears, it doesn't mean that you're like everybody else, because your particular combination of talents and fears is going to be very different. And so your mission in that sense is unique. And I ended my homily 2 weeks ago by proposing what I call the River of Life exercise, where I invited you to make 4 columns. And in the first column, divide up your life into 7-year chunks, 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, etc. In the second column, for each segment, write down who the important people in your life are at that stage, from 0 to 7, or from 21 to 28. Who are the important people in that segment in your life? The third column is, what were the important events that happened to you in each of these periods? And then finally, what were the important lessons that you learned, from that period of your life? Even if the lessons were done retroactively, you may be in your 40s before you figure out, what the lessons of, 7 to 14 were in your life. So I concluded the first homily with that exercise. I went on then last Sunday to differentiate between values and ideals, because typically they're used synonymously, but they're very, very different. Ideals are how you would like to behave, and values are how you're likely to behave. And I gave an example of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's an extraordinary ideal. But the values of the time were very, very different. All men are created equal as long as they're not indigenous population or African Americans or women. So it took us over 200 years to rectify these inadequacies. So the ideal was one thing, but the values are very different. Or to use a metaphor I've used, when you're on a journey, your ideals are the stated destination. You get into your car and you plug in your GPS system. Here's where I want to go. So there's your ideals. But then you ignore the directions you're getting from the GPS because unconsciously you actually want to be someplace else. So you ignore the directions, and so you're following your values. You're ignoring the GPS and you're following the unconscious needs that you have. So there's a big difference between ideals and values. I talked about the Akashic Records, and to realize that we are not just passive receivers of traditional teachings. We're active and we're interactive in God's game of Lila. And so there's a beautiful statement in the Jewish liturgy that says, in every generation, the children of Torah become its builders. So we're not just to kind of inherit the heritage from the people who've gone before us, but to build upon it and modify it as is necessary. So the morphogenetic field then, that kind of the morphological agent that forms life, that takes the clay and in the hands of the potter and becomes something useful like a cup or a plate. And so the morphogenetic field then is the species-specific subset of the Akashic Records. It's that particular subset of the field, which is how to be a human being, or how to be an oak tree, or how to be a bunny rabbit. And the Akashic Records then are the total archives of all of creation since the Big Bang. It's as if God is a doting grandmother who videotapes and audio tapes everything all of our children and grandchildren are doing. So the Akashic Records then are available for any of us if you know how to access them. So you can learn from the wisdom of the past and contribute your own, because you're uploading your own experiences to this hall of records. I went on to speak then briefly of reincarnation, and to realize that there is no way that a soul could grok Earth life from playing just one role one time. So it's a cumulative learning and a cumulative growth process. You can't grok William Shakespeare by just reading one of his sonnets, or acting in one of his plays. You don't know who Shakespeare is if all you've read is Hamlet. And so in that sense, then we have to do it again and again and again until finally, no matter what configuration we find ourselves in, we're able to harvest it for love and for compassion for other people. And I don't know of any system which is better at ending prejudice than the realization of reincarnation. Because once you realize you've been in all of the other combinations and permutations before, then there are huge sociological shifts, there are huge theological shifts, and there are huge psychological shifts. You can't be prejudiced anymore if you remember that you've been in all of the other configurations before. I spoke as well then about free will and about temptation. And I constantly make this distinction between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. So the only truly free person is the person who is free of addictions of various kinds and is following what God is asking of us. Now, the problem is that the more advanced the soul is, or the more advanced a life form is, the greater its ability and the bigger are the temptations. So when you graduate, for instance, into angelic realms, you have extraordinary abilities, but you also have extraordinary temptations. And this is kind of the fall of Lucifer. So all temptation is ultimately to power and control of resources and people and institutions. And we see this all over the world. We see it in our politics. We see it in religion. We see it in the news media. We see it in the finance industry. We see it in education. We see it in military. And we had a glaring case of it in 1870 at Vatican I with the notion of papal infallibility, that there's a man in Rome that wears a big hat who's infallible when he speaks ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals affecting all the people, that he can't err. Now, the light side of temptation is this. Rumi put it very beautifully. He said, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. And Shakespeare would say, there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. So it's the imposition of templates over the raw data of experience that create, the light and the dark. So whoever Satan is, whatever you believe Satan to be, we are meant to work with that reality in order to grow spiritually. So temptation is not an invitation to evil, but is to hone our faculty of discernment. Without temptation, we would simply be robots pre-programmed to be good, whatever you mean by good. I talked about memes. So memes are to a culture what genes are to an organism. Every organism is simply a unique combination of genetic material. And every culture is a unique combination of memes or stories that people choose to believe in. So the archetypes are the ideal form. And then the complexes are the imperfect physical manifestation of that. And I keep giving the example of, so I said, the mother complex. And the realization that in Jungian psychology, a complex is not a hang-up. That is not what a complex means. A complex is not a hang-up. It is the kind of the manifestation of an archetype. So every little baby is born with the archetype of mother, the mother archetype imprinted on its soul. The expectation that there will be a woman with breasts and milk that will cuddle me and hold me and protect me and feed me and love me. That's the archetype of the mother. However, the real mother whom I encounter will be far from perfect. And so eventually I'll build up a kind of an association of emotionally charged, experiences around the physical woman that I call mother. And that is the mother complex. So the mother complex is a kind of an imperfect rendition of the ideal archetype. So that's the difference between memes and genes. I spoke about the notion of a preconception contract. So as you were deciding to parachute into incarnation, you made decisions about when you were going to come in, at what stage of human history, where you were going to come in, what geographical region, among whom were you going to be born, what kind of a family were you choosing, and what your unique mission might be. And so before we come in, as we're sitting with our guides preparing for the next incarnation, we learn the history of all of the other people with whom we're going to share the planet. We know exactly what their track record has been, and we know what kind of mistakes they're liable to make and what love they possibly can manifest. So I know exactly the history of everybody, including myself. And I know that my general mission is to wake myself up from the sleep of being born, in a physical body, then to help wake others up, and then finally to wake the planet up to Christ consciousness. And the last thing that Grandmother God whispers in our ear before we parachute into incarnation is to tell you what your secret, sacred name is. There is a specific personal logos for you. And when you learn to vibrate with that, or to harmonize with that logos, with that vibration, then your soul morphs into its earth mission. And finally, last Sunday, I offered another exercise. I call it the hero's journey, where I invite you to pick 5 heroes or heroines. That can be characters from the scriptures, historical figures, current figures, people that you know personally. To pick 5 people. And for each of them to highlight a different trait that you admire in each of these 5 people. Then thirdly, to rate the trait on a score of 1 to 10. How well do they personify this particular gift? Compassion or love or courage, whatever it is. And then rate yourself on the same scale for that same attribute. And then finally, create an action plan to bridge the gap between your performance and your hero's performance. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. So let's get into the Q&A.
I have a question about updating our personal cosmology.
Right.
I'd like, I know that you're talking about this, but do you have any more specific suggestions about how to do it, especially when you feel like you don't have the energy to do it, like feeling overwhelmed and buried or for long periods of time with things. And are we updating it unconsciously? We don't know it, or do you have some specific ways to help us feel like we can do it?
So you built 3 questions into one, Johanna. Good.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So I got to take them in reverse order. Are we doing this unconsciously? We're not doing it unconsciously. What's happening unconsciously is that we're embedding deeper and deeper and deeper the pre-existing, personal cosmology. And part of that is that we continue to listen to the same kinds of news sources that imprint deeper and deeper and deeper what our belief systems are. So an interesting practice for me is at the end of the day to ask a question. And the Jesuits use this quite a lot. The Jesuits differentiate between examination of conscience and examination of consciousness. So as Catholics, we are told when you went to confession, you had to do an examination of conscience. How many times did I steal candy? How many times did I tell lies? Whatever, and list them off. So I'm examining my conscience. The Jesuits say it's an examination of consciousness. With what level of mindfulness have I lived my day today? So that's a very powerful exercise. At the end of the day, to review the day and say, okay, how present was I to the encounters of the day? How much mindfulness did I have? How did I respond? Was it with compassion or with anger? And then figure out, okay, let me deal with it tomorrow. So I have something that I recommend to my clients very, very often, is that they do what I call a morning offering and a night review. So in the morning, I say, take one item that you really want to work on, your patience perhaps, or whatever. And you get out of bed in the morning, you kneel at the side of the bed, and you make the intention, today, I will be really conscious of trying to be patient with the people in my life. And then before I go to bed at night, kneel at the side of the bed and review it and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, in general, how would I grade my performance on patience today? And then I get a score of a 3 or a 5 or whatever. And then keep that up for about a week with that intention every single morning, patience, patience, patience. And at the end of the day, how well did I do? And if you're interested in mathematics, make a graph of it. Sometimes a visual representation, or you're an artist, do an artistic representation of it, where you can actually see a visual kind of a reflection of how you behaved. So in that way, then, that gives you data points in order to answer your first question. How do you then update your cosmology? You're saying, okay, my existing cosmology led to being an impatient person. What do I need to change in my cosmology to become a more compassionate or a more patient person? Yeah, great questions. Thank you.
And by the way, Johanna, I don't know if you've been through the Why book or not, but it's taken me almost a year, and I still go back and refer to it, and I sort of saw the purpose of it to come up with my own personal cosmology. But then I also realized every time I went back and read it that I was adding events or people that I hadn't thought of the first time around, and that all that was contributing to a slight change in what my personal cosmology might have been. But my question was about the word ego, which we don't hear mentioned that much in our spiritual discussions. And I know it's a human and psychological construct and a part of the mind's operation. But I wondered if it's something we're born with, or does it evolve and grow as sort of on a primal limbic level, a self-preservation mechanism, but because it also identifies us as separate from God and from others, and that part needs to be dealt with in our evolution, how it fits into that level of those multiple levels of consciousness that you mentioned as we evolve.
Great question, Tom. And so, as you know, when you read psychology, different psychologists define ego very differently, like Freud and Jung had very different definitions of it. So basically, ego is just the Latin word for I, myself. That's where it comes from originally. And so ego, and I'm a Jungian much more than a Freudian in my thinking. For Jung, the ego was simply the CEO of a particular state of consciousness. And it is very important. Without an ego, I couldn't pay my taxes, stop at red lights, or tie my shoelaces. So there has to be a sense of, a personal sense of this spirit in the spacesuit. So the ego is very important. Now, the ego actually comes into being around the age of 8 months in a developing neonate. So for the first 8 months or so, a child has no sense of separate self. Everything around it is wondrous. So it's going to stick its big toe into its mouth. It's going to put pencils in its mouth. And so everything in some sense is just a unity consciousness. So there's at that stage, there's just what's called the mother-child complex. It's a unitary organism as far as the child is concerned, and the child is in charge of it. So the child is hungry, it screams, and mother arrives. So the child is in charge of this mother-child complex. About the age of 8 months, it begins to differentiate out and realize, that mother can go away from me. Sometimes I scream and nobody comes. And it's a horrible realization. And at this stage, we have to develop a whole bunch of defense mechanisms. For the first time ever, the little neonate realizes that there's not just one of us. I'm not the universe. I'm not in charge of the universe. The universe does not answer to my needs. There are 2 of us, and she's in the power position. So I have to develop all kinds of defense mechanisms to make sure that I level the playing field. So for some kids, it's be this sweet little smiling kid that mother's going to want to grab and cuddle. For somebody else, he's going to scream his head off in order to get our attention. And you see it going right through the childhood years in school situations. For one kid, he figures out that being the class clown is the way to kind of get attention. For another kid, it's, being a sportsman, that's how to get attention. For another, it's being the scholar, coming home with A+, that's how I get attention. So we develop all these defense mechanisms in order to shore up this very, very fragile sense of separate self. Now, going side by side with that, when we're on the spiritual journey, we're on this trajectory, this spectrum that begins at service to self at one end and service to other at the other end. Every single one of us is born a complete narcissist. We would not survive infancy if we weren't narcissistic, wanting, breath, air, milk, food, mother, comfort, whatever. But we're supposed to grow through that. And at some stage, if we're on a spiritual journey, cross the 50% mark, where we realize that I'm spending even more time loving others and caring for others than I'm doing for myself. Now, I can't abandon myself. I still have to pay my taxes. I still have to drive. I still have to eat. But the ego has been relegated to the CEO of a particular state of consciousness. And many of the proverbs of Jesus, when you understand this, that's what he's talking about. When he talks about the master and the steward, he's not talking about some landowner and a peasant. He's talking about the soul and the ego. And the ego is really important as a servant to the soul. But when the ego thinks it is the master of the household, then all hell breaks loose. And so in the journey then, it's the holding the physiological evolution with the psychological, the sociological, and the spiritual evolution as well.
I wonder about judgment and what it might be like to let go of judgment.
Okay, great. Brief and to the point, I love it. So there's a huge distinction I make between judgment and evaluation. Jesus tells us very strongly, do not judge and you will not be judged. At the same time, he's living in a situation where he's having to evaluate on a relations by relationship basis what the appropriate response to a situation is. So a judgment is a kind of ascribing ontological value to a person or to an event. That's a bad person, or this is an unlucky circumstance. So you're pigeonholing an event or a person. That's judgment. You're ascribing ontological value in its kind of value in itself. Judgment is determining the appropriate response in this situation, to these circumstances, and to this person. So they're radically different. You can't navigate through life without some measure of evaluation. You're doing it in your car every day. You get to a crossroads, you have to figure out, should I go left or should I go right? The same thing is true in the journey of life itself. Is this relationship something that's really kind of helping me become more spiritual, or is it getting my way, for instance? So it's not a question of, judging my partner and saying my partner is an evil person, I need to split from them. It was the evaluation might be, the relationship has offered both of us what we needed for this relationship. And now what it's calling for is learning how to lovingly, and compassionately, sever this form of the relationship. So there's a huge distinction then between the two, between evaluation and judgment. Great question. Thank you.
My question is, if the trigger is disappointment, let's say the trigger is disappointment, right, is the life's work to work on gratitude?
Beautiful. If the trigger is disappointment, so what disappointment means is I have a kind of I have something I want to accomplish or something I want to achieve, and it's not working out the way I wanted it. Now, this is important not just at an individual level. It's true at a cultural level. It's true at a global level. Even for deeply spiritual people, the temptation for all of us is, I want things to get better immediately, and I want it to happen the way I want it to happen. So I'm choosing the timing of it, and I'm choosing the methodology through which it needs to happen. And the realization is, this is God's gig. God has been at it in this cosmos for 13.8 billion years. And so I'm not going to force her hand and tell her, here's how it has to happen, and here's when it needs to occur. So a disappointment then
patience.
Yeah, it's the difference between my expectation and my need to control the outcome on the one hand, and the place that this situation plays in my life right now. So patience is part of it. And patience, when you study the Latin languages, in Latin and in Spanish, Portuguese, the whole that configuration, patience is pax scientia, which literally means the science of making peace. So patience is the science of making peace. That's what the word patience actually means, the etymology of it. So what does it look like to make peace? Now, I'm disappointed with a situation. I've got my agenda. I've got a timeline. I've got a methodology. It's not happening. So how do I make peace with that situation and make peace with any other people who may be involved in this situation in such a way that the plan can unfold in God's time and in God's method?